The heat was a physical presence, a predator that stalked the Mojave Desert floor. It shimmered in waves off the asphalt of the long, straight road leading to the Aegis Fusion Center, making the distant blockhouses of the facility dance and warp. Inside the perimeter, the air was different. It still carried the scent of baked creosote and dust, but it was layered with the artificial smells of military precision, the sharp tang of ozone from humming power conduits, the faint bitterness of cordite from the live fire ranges, and the clean metallic scent of chilled air bleeding from the hermetically sealed buildings. Aegis was a temple built to the god of modern warfare, a place where the digital ghosts of cyber warfare met the brute force of kinetics, and the air itself was thick with the silent hum of data flowing like a river. From his vantage point inside the cool, dim cavern of the main command and control nexus, Master Sergeant Grant Thorne felt like a high priest in this temple. He was a bull of a man, carved from granite and gristle, with a neck as thick as a mortar tube, and a voice that had been honed on 1,000 shouting matches with jet engines and rolling artillery. His Marine Corps dress uniform, worn for a VIP tour later that day, was a work of art, all sharp creases and gleaming brass, a stark contrast to the functional flight suits and rumpled fatigues of the Air Force technicians and Army Rangers who populated the space. He held a ceramic mug of coffee in one hand, the other resting proprietorially on the polished steel railing overlooking the main operations floor. Below him, dozens of operators sat in tiered rows, their faces illuminated by the glow of holographic displays and tactical overlays, a silent congregation attending to their digital psalms. Thorne took a loud sip of his coffee. "Look at 'em," he boomed, his voice easily cutting through the low thrum of the servers. A small group of younger sergeants and a fresh-faced lieutenant, his audience, chuckled appreciatively. "All these kids with their glowing maps and their fancy algorithms. They think war is a video game. They forget that at the end of every single one of those data packets is a trigger that has to be pulled by a real Marine, a real soldier." He tapped a thick finger against his own chest for emphasis. "Flesh and blood. That's what wins wars, not this pixelated nonsense." His gaze swept the room with a practiced air of ownership. He was the senior enlisted leader for the entire training cadre at Aegis, a position he wielded with the subtlety of a sledgehammer. He believed in a clear, loud hierarchy. He believed that strength was loud, that authority had to be constantly performed, and that competence was measured in decibels and crisp uniforms. His eyes, accustomed to scanning for threats and enforcing discipline, snagged on an anomaly, a disruption in the carefully orchestrated pattern of the room. She was standing near the primary tactical network server bank, a section of the floor that was technically restricted during pre-operational checks. She was a woman of indeterminate age, maybe late 40s, dressed in simple, unadorned olive-drab fatigues with no rank, no name tape, no unit patch. They were clean but functional, fitting her in a way that suggested utility over presentation. Her hair was a sensible, unassuming brown, pulled back in a tight bun. She wore thin-framed glasses, and behind them, her eyes were not on the people or the drama of the room, but fixed on a small, secondary diagnostic screen that most of the operators ignored. She was utterly still, a pocket of silence in the buzzing room. To Master Sergeant Thorne, she looked like a lost librarian, a civilian contractor who had wandered out of her designated cubicle. She looked weak. She looked out of place. "Who the hell is that?" Thorne's voice dropped from a boom to a low growl. The lieutenant squinted. "I don't know, Master Sergeant. Maybe with the civilian tech support team? They're running final diagnostics for Operation Cerberus." "Tech support doesn't get to wander onto the command floor," Thorne grunted, "especially not near the Cerberus node. That's a closed system." He saw her as a contamination, a smudge on the pristine order of his domain. He felt a surge of irritation, the kind a meticulous groundskeeper feels upon finding a single weed in a perfect lawn. It was his job to pull that weed. Publicly. Across the room, in a darkened corner where the Navy SEALs had carved out their own territory, Chief Petty Officer Marcus Valerius watched the same scene unfold. Valerius was the antithesis of Thorne. Where Thorne was a roaring bonfire, Valerius was compressed carbon. He was of average height and build, his quiet demeanor a form of camouflage. He had spent 2 decades moving through the most dangerous places on Earth and had learned that silence was armor and stillness was a weapon. He was observing Thorne's performance with the detached interest of a biologist studying a posturing silverback gorilla. His attention, however, was drawn more intensely to the woman. He had noticed her an hour ago. Unlike Thorn, who saw a lost civilian, Valerius saw something else. He saw an economy of motion that was rare even among his own kind. She did not fidget. She did not look around nervously. Her posture was relaxed but perfectly balanced, a state of readiness that was practiced, not accidental. Her eyes, when they scanned the diagnostic screen, moved with purpose, tracking data with a speed and focus that was unnerving. He had seen that look before, in the eyes of master bomb technicians studying a complex device, or in his own team's sniper as he read the wind. It was the look of absolute predatory focus. He did not know who she was, but he knew, with a certainty that resonated in his bones, that she was not a librarian. She was something far more dangerous. Thorn pushed himself off the railing. "All right, gentlemen, time to teach someone about rules and regulations." He descended the metal staircase to the operations floor, his boots clanging with deliberate rhythmic authority. Each step was a proclamation of his impending arrival. The operators in the front rows stiffened slightly, their focus wavering as the master sergeant's considerable presence moved through them like a pressure wave. He stopped a few feet behind the woman. She did not react. She did not seem to notice him at all, her attention wholly consumed by the flickering lines of code on the small screen. This, more than anything, stoked Thorn's anger. It was a denial of his presence, a rejection of the social gravity he worked so hard to cultivate. He was used to being the center of any room he entered. "Ma'am," he said, his voice a condescending baritone. It was the voice one used for a confused old woman who had wandered into traffic. She did not turn. Her head tilted slightly, a subtle gesture of deeper concentration. Thorn's jaw tightened. He stepped closer, moving into her peripheral vision. "Excuse me, ma'am," he repeated, louder this time, infusing the word with a thick layer of patronizing authority. "I don't know who you are or which department you've strayed from, but this is a restricted area. You don't belong here." The woman finally broke her concentration. She turned her head slowly, her movements unhurried. She looked at his polished boots, then let her gaze travel up the immaculate uniform, over the chest full of ribbons, to his florid, angry face. Her own expression was placid, a calm lake unruffled by his storm. There was no fear in her eyes, no deference, only a quiet, analytical curiosity. "I'm observing system latency prior to the simulation launch," she stated. Her voice was low and even, a stark contrast to his booming cadence. It was a voice that wasted no energy, a voice made of pure fact. Thorn felt a flash of rage. The sheer, unadulterated calm of her response was a greater insult than any shouted retort could have been. She was not arguing. She was not apologizing. She was correcting him. He felt the eyes of the junior operators on his back. He had to reassert control. "I don't care if you're observing the mating dance of the desert cockroach, sweetheart," he sneered, the pet name a deliberate barb meant to diminish her. "This is the command node for a multi-billion-dollar joint service exercise. The sign says, 'Authorized personnel only.' I don't see your authorization, so I'm going to have to ask you to take your little science project and go back to whichever cubicle they let you out of." From his corner, Valerius watched Thorn's face redden, the muscles in his jaw bunching. The master sergeant was used to a world of stimulus and response. You shout, they jump. You intimidate, they shrink. This woman was a black hole for his energy. She absorbed his aggression and gave nothing back. Valerius saw the flicker of panic in Thorn's eyes that masqueraded as anger. He was losing control of the encounter. The woman, Ava, simply looked at him. She did not rise to the bait of his insults. She processed them as irrelevant data. Her internal world was not one of ego and status, but of systems and processes. She had identified a recursive error in the network's data packet handling protocol, a subtle flaw that created microsecond delays that could cascade into catastrophic targeting failures under heavy load. The simulation, Operation Cerberus, was designed to create precisely that level of load. The system was going to fail. Master Sergeant Thorn's tantrum was, to her, just another form of system noise, a loud but predictable variable in the human component of the operation. "The system is unstable," she said, her voice still impossibly calm. "The latency in the primary routing hub is exceeding acceptable parameters. It will experience critical failure within the first 10 minutes of the simulation." Thorn let out a short, sharp bark of a laugh. It was a sound of pure derision. "Is that right? The librarian says the system is going to fail." He turned to his small audience, a wide, mocking grin on his face. "Gentlemen, you hear that? This multi-billion-dollar network, designed by the best minds at DARPA and maintained by a platoon of certified geniuses, has been diagnosed as unstable by— "What's your name again, ma'am?" "Doesn't matter." He turned back to her, his face a mask of contemptuous pity. "Look, I appreciate your concern, really, but we have actual experts for this. Why don't you let the men do their jobs?" The final sentence hung in the air, heavy and rank. It was the core of his worldview, distilled into a single poisonous phrase. Valerius felt a muscle in his own jaw tighten. He had seen men like Thorn before, men who confused their rank with expertise, who believed their gender was a qualification. They were liabilities. In the field, they got people killed. Before the woman could respond, a new voice cut through the tension, this one calm but carrying the effortless authority of high command. "Is there a problem, Master Sergeant?" Colonel Davies, the commander of the Aegis Fusion Center, stood at the top of the stairs, observing the scene. He was a tall, lean man with graying temples and the patient eyes of a chess master. He was not in a dress uniform. He wore the same simple fatigues as the operators, his colonel's eagles the only sign of his rank. His gaze was fixed on Thorn, but he was acutely aware of the woman. He had been expecting her. He had, in fact, arranged for her unescorted, unannounced presence. Thorn immediately stiffened, his posture snapping from aggressive swagger to parade ground rigidity. "No problem, sir," he barked, "just escorting an unauthorized civilian from the operations floor. She seems to be a little lost." Davies descended the stairs, his movements as quiet and deliberate as Valerius's. He did not look at Thorn. His eyes were on the woman. "Is that so?" he said, his tone neutral. He stopped beside her, giving her a slight, almost imperceptible nod. "This is Eva. She's here at my invitation." Thorn's face registered a flicker of confusion, but it was quickly replaced by a new calculation. If she was a guest of the colonel, he had to be more diplomatic, but his core assumption remained unchanged. She was a civilian, a VIP's pet project, perhaps, an academic. He would play along, but his contempt remained. "My apologies, sir." "And to you, ma'am," he said, the apology sounding more like a dismissal. "I was simply concerned about operational security. If you'd like a tour, I'd be happy to show you the less sensitive areas." The woman, Eva, turned her attention back to the diagnostic screen, effectively ending the conversation. She had already gathered the data she needed. The confrontation was over. The system's failure was now inevitable, and she would be there to watch it burn. Colonel Davies looked at Thorn, a glimmer of something cold and hard in his eyes. "That won't be necessary, Master Sergeant. Eva is exactly where she needs to be, as are you. Now, let's prepare to initiate Operation Cerberus. You were so confident in the system. Let's see it perform." A klaxon sounded, a deep, resonant tone that signaled the start of the exercise. "Operation Cerberus is live. All stations, red condition," a synthesized voice announced from the overhead speakers. The lights in the C&C dimmed further, and the main holographic display in the center of the room flickered to life. A vast three-dimensional map of the Nevada desert bloomed in the air, dotted with hundreds of icons, blue for friendly forces, red for simulated adversaries, yellow for air assets. It was a beautiful, terrifyingly complex ballet of modern warfare. "All systems green. We are a go," an operator called out from the first tier. Thorn swelled with pride, shooting a triumphant, condescending smirk in Eva's direction. She did not see it. Her eyes were still fixed on her small screen, watching a single line of data that was beginning to pulse with a sickly, erratic rhythm. The first phase of the operation was a simulated Special Forces infiltration. On the holomap, a team of blue icons, representing Valerius's SEALs who were out in the field, moved swiftly toward a red objective. They needed real-time satellite imagery and drone support, their targeting data fed directly to their helmet-mounted displays. For the first 5 minutes, everything worked flawlessly. The data flowed, the system hummed. Thorn allowed himself a moment of smug satisfaction. The librarian had been wrong. Then, the world broke. It started as a flicker. On the main map, the video feed from a Predator drone stuttered, then froze. "Losing video link, Predator 1, a young airman called out, his voice tight with sudden stress. "Re-establish the link now," Thorn barked, his parade ground voice returning. "Trying, Master Sergeant, but the entire network is lagging," another operator shouted. On the main screen, icons began to jitter and jump. Data streams dissolved into pixelated garbage. A high-pitched alarm began to shriek through the room, the sound of digital death. "What's going on?" Davies asked, his voice low and dangerous. "It's a cascade failure, sir," the lead technician yelled, his hands flying across his keyboard. "The primary router is throwing errors. It's not handling the data load. It's choking." Thorne's face had gone pale. He stormed over to the technician's console, shoving the young man aside. "Give me that," he began typing, his thick fingers surprisingly nimble, inputting the standard reset and reboot protocols. These were the textbook solutions, the things he had drilled into his subordinates 100 times. The system fought him. The screen filled with error messages, a digital torrent of defiance. "Reroute through the secondary server," Thorne commanded. "Negative, Master Sergeant. The handshake is failing. The secondary won't sync. It's rejecting the connection." Panic began to snake through the room, a cold, acrid scent mixing with the smell of ozone. The beautiful, complex ballet on the holomap had devolved into a chaotic mess. The SEAL team on the ground was now blind, their digital umbilical cord to the command center severed. In a real-world scenario, they would be dead. Thorne slammed his fist on the console. "Damn it, it's the hardware. It's got to be a faulty router. This is what happens when we rely on these egghead toys. Abort the simulation. Abort it now," he was shouting, not to give orders but to deflect blame. It was the system's fault, the designer's fault, anyone's fault but his. He had performed his function, followed his procedures. The machine had failed him. "We can't abort, Master Sergeant," the lead tech said, his voice trembling. "The command protocols are locked in the corrupted data stream. We're locked out. We have no control." The room fell into a stunned, horrified silence, broken only by the shrieking of the alarm. They were adrift, captains of a billion-dollar ship with a dead rudder, watching their crew sail into a storm. Thorne stood frozen, his face a mask of impotent fury and dawning humiliation. He had declared the system perfect, and it had spectacularly disintegrated in front of the entire command staff and the colonel himself. He had failed. Into that silence, a single, calm voice spoke. "The problem is not the hardware." Every head in the room turned. Ava was standing by the server bank, her expression unchanged. She had not moved. She had simply watched, waited, and diagnosed. Thorne spun to face her, his face contorted with a fresh wave of fury. "You! I've had enough of you! Get her out of here, now!" he roared at the nearest security guard. "Stand down, Master Sergeant," Colonel Davies said. His voice was like a shard of glass. It cut through Thorne's rage and left him standing, mouth agape, his order dying in his throat. Davies walked over to Ava. He did not address the room. He addressed only her. "Can you fix it, Ava?" he asked, his voice a simple, direct question from one professional to another. "Yes," she said. It was not a boast. It was a statement of fact. "Then do it," Davies commanded. Eva walked past the frozen Master Sergeant Thorne without a glance. The entire room watched, a silent, captive audience. They expected her to sit at the main console, to use the sophisticated interface. Instead, she knelt beside the primary server rack, the very one Thorne had declared faulty. From a small pouch on her belt, she produced two items that looked ancient in this temple of technology. One was a standard-looking multimeter, the kind an electrician might use. The other was a custom-made data cable, a strange hybrid of fiber optic and coaxial connectors with a small, unadorned black box in the middle. Thorne scoffed, a strangled, incredulous sound. What is she going to do? Hit it with a hammer? No one laughed. The room was holding its collective breath. Eva ignored him. Her movements were a study in fluid efficiency. She unscrewed a small, forgotten panel on the side of the server rack. It was a physical maintenance port, a relic from the system's early prototype days, long since deemed obsolete by the software engineers who preferred to work through remote terminals. Most people in the room didn't even know it was there. Ava knew. She had designed it. She connected her custom cable to the port. The other end, she plugged not into a laptop, but directly into a specific socket on the server's main power distribution unit. A low hum came from the small black box on her cable. She was not rebooting the system. She was performing open-heart surgery. She was bypassing the entire corrupted operating system, the layers of bloated, inefficient code that had been added over the years, and was communicating directly with the machine's core hardware logic. Her fingers moved with a surgeon's precision. She used the multimeter to test the voltage across specific pins in the port, her eyes watching the readings with an intensity that seemed to bend the light around her. She was not typing commands. She was speaking to the machine in its native language of electricity and raw data. Valerius moved from his corner, his steps silent. He came and stood near her, not to interfere, but to watch. He recognized this. It was mastery. It was the same as watching a master armorer remachine a faulty firing pin with a hand file, or a master tracker reading a week-old trail on bare rock. It was a language of touch and feel, of instinct backed by a billion hours of practice. He saw that she needed to hold a small grounding wire against a specific contact point while manipulating the multimeter probes with both hands. It was a three-handed job. Without a word, Valerius knelt beside her. He took the grounding wire from her, his eyes asking the question. She gave him a single brief nod indicating the contact point. He pressed the wire into place and held it perfectly still, his large, calloused hand a rock-solid extension of her will. It was a silent, seamless partnership between two masters of different yet similar crafts. Thorn watched, his mouth hanging open, as the quiet SEAL chief became a willing assistant to the woman he had tried to throw out. Eva continued her work. Her eyes darted between the multimeter and the small diagnostic screen, which was now displaying a raw data stream that looked like gibberish to everyone else. To her, it was a conversation. She was isolating the recursive loop, the tiny piece of flawed logic that was causing the data traffic jam. She wasn't just clearing the jam, she was reprogramming the traffic light at the fundamental level. She sent a series of precise electrical pulses through her cable, a coded message written in volts and amps. On the main holomap, a single drone feed flickered back to life. Then another. The stuttering icons smoothed out, the shrieking alarm cut off abruptly, plunging the room into an even deeper, more profound silence. The data streams on the operator's screens, once red with errors, all flashed green in a rolling synchronized wave. The lead technician stared at his console, his eyes wide with disbelief. "Sir, the network is stable, more than stable. The latency, it's gone. It's at zero. I've never seen that. It's theoretically impossible." Eva disconnected her cable and stood up, carefully screwing the small panel back into place. She gave Valerius another single, appreciative nod. He nodded back, a silent acknowledgement of respect passing between them. The entire process had taken less than 4 minutes. She turned and faced the room. Her work was done. The silence stretched, thick and heavy with awe and confusion. The operators stared, first at their perfect green-lit screens, and then at the unassuming woman in the plain fatigues. They were looking at a miracle worker. Colonel Davies let the silence hang for a long moment, allowing the reality of what had just happened to sink in. He let them absorb the image of their complete and utter failure, and her impossible, effortless success. Then he moved. He walked slowly, deliberately, across the operations floor. He walked past the lead technician, who was still staring at his screen as if it were a religious artifact. He walked past the junior operators, who shrank back as if from a passing deity. He walked directly toward Master Sergeant Grant Thorne, who stood like a statue of crumbling concrete, his face ashen, his arrogance shattered into a million pieces. Davies did not stop. He walked right past Thorne, not even gracing him with a glance, an act of dismissal more profound than any reprimand. He stopped directly in front of Eva. The entire room was focused on the two of them. Davies turned to face the assembled personnel. His voice, when he spoke, was not loud, but it filled the cavernous space, each word landing with the weight of a judicial sentence. "For the past hour," he began, his eyes sweeping over the faces of the operators, the technicians, and finally settling on Thorne. "Many of you have been wondering who this woman is. Master Sergeant Thorne, in his limited wisdom, decided she was a lost civilian. A librarian, I believe, was the term he used. He told her she didn't belong here." Davies paused, letting the words echo. Thorne flinched as if struck. "He was wrong," Davies stated, his voice dropping, becoming harder. "There is no one in this entire facility, perhaps in this entire branch of the armed forces, who belongs here more than she does." He turned slightly to better address the room. "You see this network, Operation Cerberus? The entire multi-domain integration doctrine that Aegis was built to test? She wrote it. She designed the core architecture of this network on a napkin in a forward operating base in Afghanistan 10 years ago. Because the old system got a fire team killed, she did it in a single night." A wave of murmurs rippled through the room, a sound of dawning, horrified comprehension. "You see the targeting pod on the F-35s that are about to check in?" Davies continued, his voice relentless. "She holds the patent on the focusing crystal assembly, a patent she immediately signed over to the Department of Defense for $1. The system she just bypassed, she built the prototype with her own hands using salvaged parts from a downed helicopter. The obsolete port she just used is called the Rostova Key, named after her, because she was the only one who ever truly understood how to speak to the soul of the machine. He took a breath, his gaze finding Thorne's again. The master sergeant looked like he was going to be sick. 2 years ago, during the Cassian Strait crisis, a cyber attack from a near-peer adversary took down the entire command and control network for the Fifth Fleet. For 17 hours, they were blind and deaf, sailing toward an enemy ambush. While generals panicked and admirals postured, this librarian got on a plane, flew into the crisis zone, and single-handedly rebuilt the network's core code from scratch. She didn't just restore it, she used the enemy's own intrusion signature to build a counter-exploit that dismantled their entire intelligence-gathering apparatus for the next 6 months. The official report is still classified above top secret, but it is known in certain circles as the 17-hour war. She fought it alone, with a keyboard, and she won. Davies let that final revelation settle. The room was utterly still, the air thick with the weight of history, of legend made real. The quiet woman in the plain fatigues was not just an expert, she was a ghost, a myth from the secret corridors of power, walking among them. Finally, Davies turned his full attention back to Eva. His entire demeanor changed. The hardness left his face, replaced by a look of profound, absolute respect. "This is General Eva Rostova," he announced, his voice ringing with pride. "Commander, Joint Cybernetics and Advanced Warfare Command, and as of 3 months ago, the newest 4-star general in the United States Armed Forces, responsible for the technological readiness of every soldier, sailor, airman, and Marine in our inventory." He then did something that no one in that room had ever seen a colonel do. He snapped to the most rigid, perfect position of attention he was capable of. His back was ramrod straight, his chin tucked, his eyes locked forward. He raised his right hand in a salute so sharp, so precise, it seemed to cut the air. The sound of his palm striking his brow was a crack of thunder in the silent room. "General Rostova," Colonel Davies said, his voice thick with emotion and unwavering respect. "On behalf of the Aegis Fusion Center, welcome. The facility is yours to command, ma'am." For a heartbeat, there was nothing. Then, Valerius, who had remained standing nearby, snapped his own salute, as sharp and perfect as the colonel's. His salute was a signal, a breaking of the dam. In a wave, every single person in uniform in that room, the airmen at their consoles, the Army Rangers by the door, the young lieutenant who had laughed at Thorne's jokes, rose to their feet and saluted. The sound was a deafening roar of hands slapping foreheads, a thunderclap of respect, a unified institutional apology. Only one man remained still. Master Sergeant Grant Thorne stood alone, unmoving, in the center of a room full of saluting soldiers. He was not saluting. He could not. His arms felt like lead. His world had been dismantled, atom by atom. The pillars of his identity, his volume, his certainty, his physical presence, his belief in a loud and visible hierarchy, had been ground to dust. He was a fraud, and he had just performed his fraudulence on the grandest possible stage in front of a living legend he had called Sweetheart. The shame was a physical force, crushing the air from his lungs. He stared at General Rostova, who calmly returned the colonel's salute with a simple, economical gesture of her own, and he finally, truly understood. He had not been standing in front of a librarian. He had been standing in front of a god, and he had tried to tell her that her temple was off limits. Colonel Davies held his salute until General Rostova dropped hers. Then he lowered his arm and turned to face the wreckage of a man that was Master Sergeant Thorne. The warmth and respect in his face vanished, replaced by a glacial cold. "Master Sergeant Thorne," Davies said, his voice flat and final, "your primary duty as a senior enlisted leader is the welfare and professional development of your soldiers. Your secondary duty is the successful execution of your mission. In the last hour, you have failed at both in a spectacular fashion. You did not lead, you bullied, you did not instruct, you belittled, you prized the appearance of strength over the reality of competence, you mistook volume for authority. The greatest asset this command has ever had walked onto your floor, and you tried to throw her out because she did not fit your narrow, prejudiced view of what a warrior looks like." He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a low, venomous whisper that was somehow more terrifying than Thorne's loudest roar. "You are a master of drill and ceremony, Thorne. You know how to crease a uniform and shine a boot, but you are not a leader of soldiers. You are a peacock, obsessed with the color of your own feathers. In a real-world scenario, your arrogance today would have cost lives. You are a liability this command can no longer afford." Davies straightened up. You are hereby relieved of your duties as senior enlisted leader of the Aegis training cadre. Report to my administrative officer. He will have your new assignment. You will be inventorying and restocking the supply closets for the enlisted barracks. Perhaps in the quiet and the solitude of that task, you might find a moment to reflect on the nature of humility. Dismissed. Thorn did not speak. He could not. He managed a weak, trembling parody of a salute, turned on his heel with the automated stiffness of a broken toy soldier, and walked away. He did not look at anyone. The sea of operators parted before him, their eyes averted, not in respect, but in a mixture of pity and contempt. The sound of his own boots on the metal floor, once a sound of authority, now sounded hollow and pathetic, the death march of his own career. Weeks turned into a month. The story of what happened in the C&C during Operation Cerberus spread through Aegis and then beyond, carried on the digital winds of military gossip. It became a legend, a cautionary tale whispered in ready rooms and barracks. They called it the day the ghost walked the grid. The small, forgotten maintenance panel on the server rack was encased in a clear plexiglass box, a small brass plaque mounted beneath it. It read, "The Rostova Key. Competence is quiet." It became a landmark, a stop on the unofficial tour for visiting VIPs, a silent monument to the day arrogance was brought to its knees. Grant Thorne did his work in the supply closets. The first week was a blur of shame and rage. He counted boxes, stacked uniforms, and cataloged cleaning supplies in a haze of self-pity. The silence was his enemy. In the quiet, he could not escape the memory of Davies's words, of the collective salute, of Rostova's calm, analytical eyes. He had spent his entire life building his identity around a framework of loud, performative strength. That framework was now a pile of rubble, and he did not know who he was without it. But slowly, painfully, the silence began to change from an enemy to a teacher. Stripped of his audience, of his rank's power, of the booming voice he had used as a shield, he was forced to confront the man underneath. He remembered the quiet competence of Chief Valerius, the instant recognition and respect he had offered Rostova. He remembered the general's own impossible calm, her focus not on him or his insults, but on the problem. She had not needed to shout. Her skill was her authority. Her knowledge was her weapon. One afternoon, 3 months after his public humiliation, Thorne walked out of the supply depot and went to the base's leadership academy. He found the NCO in charge of curriculum and requested a meeting. He proposed a new class for all junior NCOs. The topic, cognitive humility in leadership. The primary case study, his own catastrophic failure. He would stand in front of young sergeants and corporals and tell them the story of the day he tried to throw a 4-star general out of her own command center. He would use his shame as a teaching tool. His first class was in a small, sterile room. The dozen sergeants seated before him were nervous, aware of his reputation and his fall from grace. Thorne walked to the front of the room. He was no longer in a crisp dress uniform. He wore simple, functional fatigues, the same kind Rostova had worn. He was thinner, the bullish aggression gone from his posture. He looked at the expectant faces, took a deep breath, and began to speak. His voice was not a boom. It was quiet, measured, and heavy with the weight of a lesson learned in the crucible of public disgrace. There are 2 kinds of strength in this world, he began, his voice steady. There is the strength you perform and the strength you possess. For 20 years, I focused only on the first. I want to tell you a story about the day I learned the difference. Meanwhile, General Eva Rostova was 1,000 miles away at another facility, this one dedicated to the development of next-generation artificial intelligence for battlefield logistics. The legend of the Rostova Key was of no interest to her. The adulation, the salutes, the mythologizing, it was all just noise, inefficient and irrelevant to the next problem. She was standing in a quiet server room, a place that smelled of chilled air and hot silicon. Beside her stood a young airman, a first lieutenant who was a brilliant but painfully shy coder. The lieutenant was nervously explaining a persistent bug in his new predictive algorithm. He kept apologizing, stumbling over his words, intimidated to be in the general's presence. Rostova was not listening to his apologies. She was watching the code execute on his monitor, her eyes tracking the flow of logic. She saw the flaw, a simple, elegant error of assumption buried deep in the core heuristic. She did not point it out. She did not take over. Instead, she pointed to a secondary data stream. "What is this telling you?" she asked, her voice calm and factual. The lieutenant squinted, confused. "That's just the error log, ma'am. It's a dead end." Is it? She asked. Look again. Don't look at what it says. Look at the rhythm, the timing, the pattern of when it fails. The code is talking to you. You just have to learn its language. The young officer stared at the screen, a new light of understanding dawning in his eyes. He saw it. The pattern, the rhythm, the ghost in the machine. A slow smile spread across his face. He looked at the general, his awe now mixed with a sudden burst of inspiration. General Rostova gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod of approval. Her work was not in fixing the bug. Her work was in teaching him how to fix it himself. Her legacy was not a plaque on a wall. It was the ever-expanding network of quiet professionals she was building, one soldier, one airman, one coder at a time. The problem was the work, and the work was never finished.